All right, let's just jump right in. When you hear the name Chopin, what comes to mind? Probably, this image of perfect sheet music, where every single note is set in stone, right? But what if I told you that whole idea is just wrong? Today, we're going to flip the script on everything you thought you knew about Chopin and explore a pretty wild idea, that he was way more like a modern jazz cat than some stuffy classical composer. So let's just put it out there. Was Chopin basically a 19th century jazz star? I know, it sounds nuts. But when you start looking at the evidence, you realize that the way we treat his music today, like it's this precious museum piece that can't be touched, well, that might be the exact opposite of what the man actually wanted. And this, right here, this really gets to the heart of it. On the one hand, you've got the myth, right? The clean, perfect score we all treat like it's gospel. But on the other side, well, that's the reality. It's a score that's covered in Chopin's own handwriting. Notes, changes, totally different options. It shows you the printed page was never the end of the story. It was just the beginning. And what's so wild about this is the total contradiction, right? We think of Chopin as this guy who wrote these super precise, detailed pieces. But, and this is a big but, pretty much every account from people who actually heard him play says the same thing. He almost never played his own stuff the same way twice. So where did all that freedom, that improvisation come from? Well, the answer, and this might surprise you, isn't at the piano at all. Yeah, we've got to look at the opera singer's secret. To really unlock the code, you have to understand something called bel canto. See, Chopin wasn't just a fan of opera, he was completely obsessed with it. And that's the key. So, what exactly is bel canto? Well, the name literally means beautiful singing, but honestly, it was so much more than that. Think of it this way. The singer wasn't just performing the music. They were basically a co-creator. They were actually expected to throw in their own frills, their own runs, and embellishments to the melody. The whole point was to make it different every single night. The real art wasn't just in singing the notes, but in what you added between the notes. And look, for Chopin, this wasn't just some casual interest. This was everything. It was the absolute core of his musical philosophy. He literally told his students, if you want to understand my music, you have to go listen to the great Italian singers. He was basically saying, hey, the notes I write down, that's just the basic tune. It's your job to bring it to life, just like a singer does with an aria. So, let's talk about the notes beyond the page, the actual penciled-in evidence. Okay, so the opera was his inspiration. That's cool. But where's the hard proof in his own music? Well, it's been hiding in plain sight this whole time, penciled right into his students' sheet music. So, what are these variants? Well, Chopin would literally take his pencil and write them directly into his students' copies of his music. And we're not talking about little corrections here. These were often completely different ways to play an entire section. You can see it all over the scores of his student Jane Sterling. Sometimes he'd sketch out a simpler way to play something, but other times he'd jot down a version that was way more difficult and flashy. And this is the real takeaway here. The printed version of his music, it was really just one take of the song. It wasn't the final word. It wasn't the law. It was just one possibility out of many. He was essentially giving his students permission. No, he was encouraging them to see the music as this living, breathing thing that could and should change every time you play it. And this is where we get to Chopin's jazz solo. Think of this as a kind of 19th century Rosetta Stone. It's what lets us translate what Chopin was doing back then into a language we all understand today, the language of jazz. And what's so cool is how perfectly it all lines up. I mean, look at this. You take Chopin's fioritura, his fancy embellishments, and what is that? It's basically an improvised jazz lick or solo. Then you've got tempo rubato, or stolen time. That's just a 19th century word for swing rhythm. His steady left-hand accompaniment, that's your rhythm section, your bass and drums. And the nocturne itself, it's basically a lead sheet from a jazz fake book, a starting point for making music. So let's zoom in on this idea of fioritura. You know what I'm talking about? Those beautiful, ridiculously fast little runs of notes that seem to just float on top of the music. We usually think of them as just pretty decorations, right? But they're not. They are, essentially, a moment of pure improvisation that Chopin just happened to write down. It's like he was transcribing his own jazz solo in real time. And then you've got his famous tempo rubato. It literally means stolen time. And honestly, this is the secret sauce. Here's how it works. The left hand is rock solid. It keeps a steady beat, just like your bass and drums. But the right hand, the melody, is totally free. It pushes forward, it pulls back, it plays with the time, all against that steady pulse from the left hand. That tension is what makes it feel so spontaneous and alive. It is swing, just, the 19th century version of it. Okay, let's talk about unfreezing the music and what's called the urtext trap. It all leads to a huge question. If Chopin's music was meant to be this fluid, this improvisational, why on earth do we now treat it like it's a sacred text that can't be changed? Well, that's how we got caught in this trap and ended up freezing his music solid. It kind of happened in 3 stages. First, you get the invention of recordings, and suddenly one single performance could be heard over and over, and it started to feel like the definitive way to play it. Then you had this whole movement to find authenticity, where academics got obsessed with the printed score, the text, as the one and only source of truth. And finally, that score became the law. All of a sudden, improvising wasn't creative anymore. It was considered wrong, even disrespectful. And that brings us to the biggest irony of all, doesn't it? In our quest to be so faithful to Chopin, by treating every single one of those tiny little notes as a sacred commandment, we may have ended up completely betraying the very spirit of freedom and improvisation that his music was all about. So here's the thought I want you to really consider. Maybe the point was never just to copy the notes on the page perfectly. You could say it like this: Chopin didn't just want us to play his notes, he wanted us to learn how to speak his language. Which leaves us with one last question to chew on. What if the most important things in music, not just Chopin's music, but all music, are the things that you can't actually write down? What if the most expressive, the most human parts are the things that live between the notes on the page? Makes you wonder, what are we missing when we only listen with our eyes?